Welcome to the history of the Mitcham Village Historic Conservation Area, presented by the City of Mitcham Local History Service. Before the first settlers in 1836, the Kaurna Aborigines called the area Wirraparinga, a favourite camping and corroboree site. The land was granted to the South Australian Company for shepherds to tend to its flocks at the Brownhill Creek sheep run. In 1840, the company laid out section 248 as a village, naming it Mitcham after the manager's hometown in Surrey, England. The 134 acres of foothills land was divided into 103 lots and offered for sale, with an area of common land straddling Brownhill Creek to be set aside as a village green, as we know as the Mitcham Reserve. Around it developed many shops, hotels, coaching stables, churches and schools. Most of the shopkeepers lived in dwellings attached to the premises, while labourers occupied simple 2 or 3 room bluestone cottages. The gentry built gracious villas and huge mansions on large estates surrounding the village. Mitcham remained a compact village until after World War I, when the population and building boom of the 1920s saw surrounding fields and paddocks subdivided and the village gradually absorbed into the greater Adelaide suburban sprawl. Since 1975, the village's simple colonial architecture has been acknowledged by leading heritage bodies, with many of the buildings being individually listed on National Trust, federal, state and local government heritage registers.
My name's Richard Harris. My family first came to Mitcham in 1852, so we've been here for quite a number of years. I grew up with a lot of family stories about events around the district and decided when I retired that I would try and prove or disprove the origins of the stories and whether there was any truth in them. It's been a fascinating journey to sort of find out about the various aspects of the district. In the early days, it's said there was as many as 170 local Aborigines camped around this general area in the Brownhill Creek Valley. Right behind me, or in front of me, sorry, is the Keystone Bridge. It was built by John Prince in the 1870s. He was known as Water Cart Prince because he built a little wagon pulled by a horse, 2-wheeled wagon, and he had a large barrel mounted on it, and he delivered water from the creek to residents around the district. Prince's Road is also named after that prince. When he was building the Keystone Bridge, there was a flood and part of it got damaged, and he tried to get extra money from the council to compensate for the extra work that he had to do, but he didn't have any luck because they said he wasn't getting paid until he'd finished. The circumstance of the flood was that it occurred in February. The description of the day says it was very hot and oppressive. 2 massive clouds, one from the southeast and one from the northwest, met over Brownhill Creek Valley about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's estimated some 5 inches of rain fell in just on half an hour. The water came down at a height that we believe was over 2 metres, because on the eastern side of the arch of the Keystone Bridge there's a piece of stone missing, and during recent renovations of the bridge it was decided to leave that stone missing as it was as a height for the water. The little tunnel on the northern side of the Keystone Bridge is not a pedestrian tunnel. That was in a later addition, and it was added as a flood water tunnel. Also on the eastern side of the bridge is the site of the original ford. 2 big pieces of red gum were axed or dressed with an axe and laid across the creek as a barrier, so that built up a little bit with stones, etc., and that's still visible today. The roots of one of the red gums has grown over the top of that particular ford. The bandstand to the north of where I'm standing is the third one on the reserve, but that one's supposedly on the site of where the original church and school was. There was another one a little bit further into the park that was demolished in the 1960s. That was an elevated one, and it was a memorial bandstand. The height of it was probably about 1.5 metres, 2 metres off the ground. Had a trap door in the floor of it, and that's where the band used to store their chairs, etc., between concerts. The concerts were very popular. People used to drive up in their cars and park on the road alongside of it and listen to the band who played during the summer months on a monthly basis. The memorial was the site of arguably one of the first schools in South Australia, and it was also where the Mitcham Council was first formed. The school master was Thomas Mugg, and Muggs Hill Road is named after him. The memorial is a soldier's memorial, just as the bandstand was a memorial bandstand, and the arch into the reserve is also part of that memorial. The centenary of it was a big event, and the cadets from Scotch College and Unley High formed a guard of honour, and the governor of the time declared the monument open. The house directly behind me is Conquest House. Conquest was a butcher's son who operated a butcher shop in Princes Road. He married one of Thomas Playford's granddaughters, and it was ironical because, being a butcher's son, his name was Fritz. Just up from Conquest House, there's classrooms at the moment, but that was open paddock up to the reserve, the Memorial Gardens. And Jack Conquest, Fritz's son, ran a bit of a menagerie there. He had goats and ducks and swans and fowls, emus, kangaroos, euros, peacocks, and of a weekend people used to pull up just to watch the animals, both from Albert Street side and from this side. There was an old DC-3 plane over one side of the paddock. It didn't have any wings on it, but that's where the chooks, etc., used to lay their eggs, and the local boys used to get in there and have egg fights, so you didn't really want to get caught with an old egg. Standing here at the moment is the site of Thomas Playford's house here in Mitcham. It was called Jerusalem. Playford's house, facing up the Brownhill Creek Valley, was quite substantial. It had its own water supply with a well, etc. here, and his children left reminiscences which tells us partly about what went on in that particular period of time. The Temperance Hotel was built in 1869. Initially it was built as a single-storey premises and was called the Mitcham Inn. Because of the involvement of the temperance movement, which was an imported movement, by that I mean it had its origins in England, where women got sick of their husbands being drunk and their children missing out on being fed properly and clothed properly, and religious organisations preached about the evils of alcohol, and over 1/3 of the hotels in South Australia at that time closed because of the influence of the temperance movement. Temperance Hotel was built in 1869. A condition of the licence of hotels of the day was that they needed to supply accommodation for a horse and its rider, or a horse on its own. Another requirement was that they had to have a room suitable to be used for inquests, a morgue. The writing on the front of the Temperance Hotel is what the subsequent owners of the hotel decided to turn it into. Tea rooms, sold cigarettes, cigars, tobacco, etc. It operated as a boarding house for a while. It was developed into flats, and it was in a pretty poor condition when the person that currently owns it redeveloped it. He didn't redevelop it to the full extent that it had been in its previous life, but the two-storey part of it he certainly did. The top story of that particular building was added 10 years after the bottom part of it had been done. Alongside the Temperance Hotel is Harris's fruit and vegetable shop on the corner of High Street and Albert Street, and Harris family, no relation to me, operated a fruit and vegetable shop there for probably 50 or 60 years. A lot of the produce they sold, they grew in the paddock behind the shop that extended all the way down High Street as far as Maitland Street. On the corner opposite Harris's fruit and vegetable shop is the Edinburgh Cellars. It was a grocer's shop, Janet Cunningham's grocery shop, and later on it was operated by Doug Gregory. The windows in the front of it have been replaced from when Gregory owned it, because he'd removed the old original windows and put in bay windows, etc. And it was used by the Village Arts and Crafts Centre after Gregory's had sort of closed, and there was a fire. So in the rebuilding of the premises after the fire, it was decided to sort of reinstate it to what it looked like originally. It has extensive cellars underneath it, and rather than keep your wine collection at home, you can rent a space there and store your wine on site. Bert Harris, brother of Fred Harris, who ran the fruit and vegetable shop, was a groundsman, a gardener up at Rust Hall, and of a weekend he used to cut the olive hedge all the way down from Albert Street to High Street and Maitland Street corner. On that particular corner is Newey's coach stables, and it's where Thomas Newey used to stable his horses, because he was one of the people that ran a coach service to Adelaide. The first one to start one was Phyllis Kinsman, and she was a widow. I'm not sure where she stabled her horses, but there was nothing new in coach transport in those days. The Edinburgh Hotel down on the corner this year is 150 years old. Both the Ed and the Temperance Hotel were built in the same year, 1869. So pretty close together for two hotels being built. It's been substantially added to over the years, and from its original size is almost unrecognisable. The car park of the Ed was housing, and over the years the current owners of the hotel have purchased those houses, demolished them, and increased the footprint of the hotel itself. Co-owners of the hotel are ex-Scotch College students, and they've owned it for somewhere around 35-40 years now, and it's quite a community social meeting place. The building on my western side was Cobbler's Cottage, and a bootmaker, shoe repairer, lived there initially. His workshop was the room on the front. It's not accessible from the house into his workroom, and you can see the door that gives him access off the veranda into that part of it. The lane is a council-owned lane now. Initially it was private, and there's 3 or 4 cottages down this particular lane, and Playford's descendants still own some of these buildings. Next door to Cobbler's Cottage was the village chemist shop, and inside of the chemist shop on the back wall is a display of the old bottles that were used during that period of time. All of these buildings that we see in our walk are built from stone that was quarried in the hills around Mitcham or Brownhill Creek. There was substantial quarrying industry, and when you look up the occupation of the residents in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, there was a lot of blacksmiths, labourers, quarrymen, etc. Across the road is the Baptist Church, and that's the western boundary of Playford's land. That church is also where Julia Gillard, our ex-Prime Minister, and her family went to church when they were living in Mitcham. The three cottages alongside the church, which all look the same, were all built by Playfords, and they did it to get an income. One of them belongs to the church now and is used as an office, and the other two are used by the school and part of the school grounds. The building behind me is the Mitcham Post Office. There was also the residence of the postmaster, and the front room was the post office itself. If you look at the stonework between the two windows, you'll see where it's been redressed, and that's because that was the site of where the letterboxes were, and when it became a private residence, obviously the letterboxes went, so the stone was replaced. The silver plate on the wall near the doors, which led into the original post office, was where a stamp machine was, and again south, next door to the main building, was the telephone box. Next door, Stamps Restaurant, was the site of Twaite's menswear shop. Twaite's rented it for some 4 or 5 years when he first started business. It's been added to on 2 or 3 occasions, so the actual shop part of it is bigger today than it was when Twaite's operated it. Unfortunately for him, his first wife passed away when he was operating that shop. It had been a haberdashery general store for linen, crockery, and when the post office closed, it became an agency for the post office as well as an agency for Bank SA. The building next door on the northern side was the original Baptist Church manse, and in the gable of that particular building, the vents have been placed in the form of a cross. The church needed to sell it in the 1950s, and it was bought by 2 of their parishioners and operated as a Christian men's boarding house for some 10 years, and now subsequently it's just normal residence. Behind the gates here at the end of Wellborn Street and in Albert Street is the entrance to Scotch College Junior School, and the gates and pillars, etc., were erected by George Prince when he built his house there. He was known as Crockery Prince, as against Watercart Prince, who Prince's Road was named after. The row of cottages immediately east of the gate was 4 cottages built by George Prince in the 1850s for his servants and various people that were working on the property at that particular time. The junior school, which we're looking at and talking about at the moment, was purchased by Scotch in 1952 and developed as a junior school. The building behind me was a bakery. Charters operated it, and followed by a gentleman named Mills, and it was a commercial bakery employing quite a few people, supplied hospitals and institutions around Adelaide. On the veranda on the southern side of the building was 2 rooms that weren't accessible from the house, and they were where the bakers slept. Wellborn Street itself is incorrectly spelt in as much it currently has an E on the end of it, whereas the original spelling was without the E. Originally there was only 3 premises on that side of the road, Wellborn's house and a blacksmith shop and the bakery. Down on the corner of Brady's Lane is a tram pole, and it's the last remaining tram pole of the electric trams service that ran up here. From Belair Road, Lower Mitcham, to the terminus, which was up by the Edinburgh Hotel cellars, it was only a single track, but it had 2 passing loops. One of the passing loops was here in Wellborn Street, just north of Brady Street. For some 15 years prior to the Institute being built, there was a group of people within the district saying that they should have a community meeting places against the hotels and the schoolhouse, which were no longer really serving the purpose for that objective. When it was built, the school had outgrown its premises on the Mitcham Reserve, and it was built as a dual purpose building for the Institute Society itself and the school. It's been a multi-purpose building ever since. The Institute had a Besser block facade put on it in the 50s, 60s, which was later removed, and the building was restored by the council when they took it over to the way it is today. There was a foundation stone laying ceremony when the Institute was built, but we've been unable to locate where the foundation stone was. It was described as being freestone, whereas the building stone itself is bluestone. It had been hollowed out, and newspapers and coins of the day had been placed in glass jars inside of the foundation stone. As I said, it had been added to several times. On the eastern side, that was the headmaster's residence. Later on, it was the sorting room for the postman, because they'd run out of room up at the post office, and the postmen used to pick up their bikes from the post office, come down here each morning to the sorting room and do their postal deliveries from here. There was quite an extensive library also on the western side when that wing was built, and locals would go there and swap their books, etc. Library, Mothers and Babies Health Centre, Mitcham Council occupied part of it for some 35 years before they moved down to Lower Mitcham. Weddings, funerals, public meetings, dances as fundraisers for scout halls, etc. and also as a picture theatre. When it was operating as a picture theatre in the 1940s, the projectionist box was over the entrance hall to the theatre and was virtually a tin shed. The grocer from the bakery used to bring down sweets, ice blocks, ice creams, etc. at interval time at the pictures, loaded on his utility, or buckboard as they were called in those days, and sell off the back of his buckboard. The shops on the corner were built in the late 1940s, early 1950s, because they could see the opportunity to make some money from the picture theatre while it was still operating. The one on the corner was built as a greengrocer delicatessen, the middle one was a barber shop, and the M1 was a butcher shop. Immediately behind these shops is a rectangular building built some 2 or 3 years after the shops, and that was built for the purpose of operating a supermarket, and it's claimed that it was the first supermarket in South Australia. It was operated by the Robins brothers. Their father was operating the shop on the corner, which was built in the 1800s by John Bradley. John Bradley was very involved with the Baptist Church. He was the one that built the Baptist manse. Police station was built on land acquired from the Institute. The original police station was down near the Mitcham shopping centre from private residence, which was rented. So this was the first owned police station in the district. The charge room is through the door on the western side of the building, and the balance of it was the policeman's accommodation or his residence. Immediately behind the police station is the jail cells. They'd been transferred from up at Belair, and initially it was a single cell, then converted into two. When the police ceased to operate from here, it became the headquarters for the CFS for the district before the council took it over and turned it into the local history service. Previously, the local history service had been operating from the old school down on Belair Road, opposite the shopping centre. The church was built on land owned by one of their parishioners, Mr. Viney, and along with the gentleman who laid the foundation stone, Mr. Colton, who later on became a Member of Parliament, were having the church meetings for the Methodists, the Westphalian Methodists, in Viney's home. And they outgrew that, so they decided to sort of build the church. Currently it's empty because they built the new one in the 1960s, and the building, while empty, I mean empty of church pews, organs, etc., is still used by Probus Club, judo classes and other people who would like to rent it. House on the corner of Gilpin Lane and Albert's Loch Ness Avenue, previously called Albert Street, was Elizabeth Bailey's house. Elizabeth Bailey bought Block 1 in the original subdivision of the village, and it was 10 acres. The 10 acres went from Belogie Road up to Wellborn Street and down as far as the Institute. The front three rooms are the original rooms, but I believe are the oldest remaining dwelling in Mitcham itself. The one on the western side is still in its original condition to a certain extent, in as much as it's got a brick floor. In the 1950s, 60s, the ceiling in it was still a Hessian bag ceiling. The window in that particular room is also original. One of the things we researched when we were looking at that particular property is to see whether bricks were being made at that period of time that I believe the house was built, and they were. Pretty well from the start of the state, brick making was taking place. The next owner of the house was Seth Fisher. He worked in the quarries, and when he passed away, it was transferred to Hannah Gilpin. Up until that point in time,